Hi, my name is Jennie Guise. I'm a practitioner psychologist. I do assessments for various types of learning difficulties. And what I'm going to talk about today is assessing adults for dyslexia. So there's three main topics I'm going to talk about. First of all, why do people have an assessment? Then I'll talk a bit about the assessment process, and then I'll talk a bit about the assessment report so that people know what to expect. So thinking about why have an assessment, the kind of things you'd be thinking about is how can an assessment help somebody? And what does an assessment mean for your learning? And what might it mean for the person in the workplace? So I'm going to talk about the type of assessments that I do. There are other people doing the same kind of assessments, obviously. I'll be looking at full cognitive assessments to see if people have any specific learning difficulties, and that would include dyslexia, but also things like dyspraxia, that's difficulties with coordination, dysgraphia, that would be difficulties with handwriting, and sometimes it's not particularly dyslexia or dyspraxia or another label, but the person does have a difficulty with their working memory or with their processing speed. So the focus on cognitive testing is very much on finding that person's strengths, because once you know someone's strengths, you then know how you can devise a strategy that can be used to help if they've got any difficulties. And then if there are any weaker areas, we can give some idea of why that person might be having difficulties. In my experience, people come to get an assessment for various different reasons. Very often it's for study. So people sometimes find it hard to revise, hard to remember things, hard to do well in exams, and they need to understand why they might be having these difficulties, to understand obstacles to learning. And sometimes they need to get support for learning, to get help with study skills, and sometimes they need to get some exam arrangements. They maybe need extra time in exams or access to a computer, that type of thing. Often people will come to get an assessment in relation to their work because they might be having difficulties with some work tasks. Now, typically that would be situations where maybe a person has been doing absolutely fine at work and then something happens, like the way that they're asked to do a task is changed. There are maybe new methods, new management. Sometimes they're finding it hard to complete work in the same amount of time as other people. And that can be quite stressful for people. So sometimes they need to know why it is that they're finding something difficult, and then so that we can figure out a way that they could be helped. And linked in with that is accessing support and reasonable adjustments. An employer is obliged to help somebody to provide reasonable adjustments if they're found to have a specific learning difficulty. And the employer can't reasonably be expected to do that unless they have an idea of that person's needs. Sometimes I'll be seeing people who are self-employed. They don't need to apply to someone else to get any kind of arrangements or support, but they want to know themselves. They're curious to find out what their strengths are, how they can best use their strengths. And there's that level of self-awareness and understanding and accepting that maybe you do something in a slightly different way, and it doesn't matter. We're all different. We learn in different ways, and we have different areas of strength and different areas of weakness, and that's that self-awareness and understanding, very important. I'm going to talk now a little bit about the assessment process. What happens when you arrange to get an assessment with somebody, and what should you expect from pre-assessment questionnaires right up to the report? The questions that have been put to me are things like how long does it take, what sort of things are you asked to do during the assessment, what's an assessor looking for? So the assessment involves a lot of information gathering, and a lot of that will be done prior to the assessment. I'd be getting in touch with the person, sending questionnaires, asking about things like background history, what kind of difficulties might they have had at school or difficulties that they might be having at work, whether there is any kind of incidence of learning difficulties in the family, that type of thing, looking at what concerns they have in relation to literacy, numeracy, what kind of things are worrying them about that, what kind of areas that they think they're stronger in, what kind of areas they might be weaker in. And that background information gives me a good idea of the combination of tests that I'd be wanting to use. Obviously, that would also, I could change that as we're going along in the assessment too, but it gives me a starting point. Then on the day of the assessment, we're going to need about 3 or 4 hours to actually carry through the whole assessment. And whether it's done face-to-face or done remotely. I'm doing all of my assessments remotely at the moment because of COVID, and that's actually working really well. And I think it's more convenient for people in a lot of cases too. They're in the comfort of their own home or their own office. They don't have to do the travelling. Often they can feel more relaxed in their own environment as well. So I'll start off doing a series of cognitive tests, and they're also called closed tests. And the reason they're called closed is because they are only available to psychologists, so they're closed to other people. And I'll explain more later about what cognitive tests actually involve, but basically what we're looking at is the person's abilities in verbal comprehension and non-verbal reasoning, so underlying ability levels to give a rough idea. And there are also tests looking much more at the style of processing. So this would be much more the mechanics of processing, things like working memory and processing speed. So that's what the cognitive tests involve. Then along with that, we'd be looking at attainment tests. So attainment tests would be things like spelling, reading, writing. That is your attainments. What have you attained in these areas? Also be looking at things like phonics, because that is a kind of key part of learning words and learning spellings and how to read words, how to decode words, that type of things. So we're not just looking at tests, there's also a qualitative analysis, and qualitative means that you're not just looking at quantity, you're not just looking at numbers and scores, you're looking at the way that that person carries out the test. So for instance, a person might do quite well in a working memory test, reasonably well, but then you can see that there's a massive amount of effort going into that. And although they've got a good score, you could be pretty sure that they might find it hard to keep that level of performance going for any extended period of time. So we're looking at how that person does the test, asking them what it felt like. Did that feel really difficult? Did you enjoy that test? Looking at their approach, and also looking at not just the number of mistakes that person makes, and it might be not very many, it might be a few, but also looking at the type of mistakes. So somebody might not make very many mistakes, but they might be very, very typically dyslexic type mistakes. Or they may make a lot of mistakes, but they don't seem to be very much related to dyslexia. So it's not just looking at scores, it's looking at the kind of whole picture to try to get a kind of complete picture of what's going on for that person. So the cognitive tests, they give scores in 2 different areas. We've got 2 areas of reasoning, and like I said before, that's verbal comprehension, and perceptual reasoning, which is also described as non-verbal reasoning. So verbal comprehension, I'm asking questions verbally, and kind of about the meanings of words, and it's to do with word concepts. And also there's the perceptual reasoning ones, which are looking at things like patterns, what comes next in a pattern. There's a lot of reasoning involved here, but you don't have to verbalise it. And by using these 2 different sorts of tests, we can get some indication of that person's strengths, because some people are pretty good verbally and maybe not so good with the visual spatial things. But some people who aren't so good verbally might be able to demonstrate their abilities in non-verbal tasks that involve a lot of reasoning. Some people are good across the board. So that's what I'm looking at, is to find out where that person's areas of strengths are. And then there are two aspects of, like what I described before as the mechanics of processing, and that's working memory and processing speed. Now, when I've done that, I can then ask, are the processing scores in the same range as the reasoning scores? So if you've got a reasoning ability that's here, is your processing at the same level? If your processing isn't quite at the same level as your reasoning ability, you might find, for instance, if the working memory is lower than the verbal ability or the non-verbal ability, the person's got that ability to work at that level, but the memory is down here. It's not keeping up. So they're not getting the chance to show that they can work at that level because they're losing bits of information as they go along. So it might be that they're, working on a task and then they forget part of what that task involves. Or they're reading something, they get to the end of a long paragraph, they can't remember everything that happened earlier on in the paragraph. Now, I think at this point it's probably worth pointing out that working memory is separate from long-term memory. So a person can have a good long-term memory. It doesn't stop, a difficulty with working memory doesn't stop you learning things and getting them into long-term memory, but it can be a slower process and a longer process for that to happen. So sometimes it takes longer to get things into long-term memory, so more repetition. Sometimes it takes longer to get things out of long-term memory. It's what we call word finding problems, that type of thing. So you know that you know the answer, it's just not coming to you straight away. So in both cases, the person's likely to need extra time to carry out their work, regardless of what the processing speed is like. Now, if the processing speed is not so great, that puts burden on working memory. If you think about it, if you're processing information quite slowly, you've got to hold it in your memory for longer. So it's the two of them are almost like two sides of a coin in some ways. So we're looking first of all at that cognitive profile. That's what I mean when we say are the processing scores in the same range as the reasoning scores. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too, about cognitive profiles. And then when we've got an idea of that person's level of reasoning, roughly, because it's very difficult to measure people, as you know, with tests, but we can get a rough idea of how well that person should be doing in the literacy tests. So we get an idea of what level of attainment scores we should expect. Now, a lot of the tests that we're able to use as psychologists, they're correlated with the literacy test, so we can actually calculate prediction statistically. Now, we're not only going by statistical scores by any manner of means, but it can be quite a useful guideline. So I think this is particularly useful to identify dyslexia maybe in people who are doing pretty well and there's no alarm bells ringing. They don't seem to be having difficulties with reading, writing or spelling because they're managing at an average level. And then you discover from their attainment they should be managing at a much higher level than average, or they're managing at the level that they should but they're having to put in much more work. And similarly, you get the same situation when somebody is struggling a bit all round and there's a kind of an inference that that's just because they do struggle. And then you discover, well, they do find some things quite hard. They do find verbal comprehension and non-verbal reasoning quite hard. But even so, their reading, writing, spelling are still lower than we expect them to. It doesn't mean that person doesn't deserve some support and help, because they still could be achieving more. Or if not achieving more, at least achieving what they're doing without it being such a lot of hard work. So this profile where the memory or the speed or both are not as high as the underlying ability, that's the verbal or the non-verbal, that's what they call the spiky profile, and you'll see that in various different explanations of dyslexia and other specific learning difficulties. So the spiky profile is associated with a number of learning difficulties. And even if it's not associated with a specific learning difficulty that has a label, a processing weakness is going to be problematic, even if it doesn't turn out to be dyslexia. If it turns out that the person's reading, writing, spelling are all roughly where you expect them to be, but they have a working memory difficulty, they're still likely to need extra time to demonstrate their abilities. So, under exam conditions, it's probably fairer for that person to have extra time. And I talked a bit before about that relationship between processing speed and working memory problems. So if you've got a low processing speed, that puts burden on working memory. If you've got difficulties with working memory and processing speed, that can kind of compound the difficulty. So the weaknesses might not be very marked, each weakness, the weakness in processing speed and the weakness in working memory, but when the two of them are together, that can cause a difficulty for that person. And so sometimes what you're seeing is quite subtle, but the fact that it's subtle doesn't mean to say that that person doesn't need some assistance, some help, some support, just to create an even playing field and to make things fairer. I think some things are particular challenges when you're working with adults. There are also challenges, obviously, with people right across the board. But I think for adults, there's a key thing in terms of there's often quite a lot at stake, which can make the person feel quite anxious. People who are at work, sometimes they have to get support for doing exams. They need to pass professional exams, sometimes to progress in their career. Sometimes they're told that they need to pass exams to stay in their job. And that's obviously very anxiety producing. And sometimes I see people who might be under a performance review because it appears that they're not able to do the job in the way that they are supposed to do it. And that can obviously be very stressful too. So we're kind of taking account of that and spend a lot of time at the start, chatting and getting this background information and making sure that the person feels comfortable about what it is that we're doing. Also have to think about previous teaching methods. A lot of adults were taught in different ways and taught in different eras, and very often they won't have been taught things like phonics, so we can't really trust too much the results of a phonics test, because if a person was never taught in that way, doing phonics tests can be quite an unusual thing to ask. In terms of skills development and literacy, often if you see an adult who has done a lot of reading over time, maybe to do with their work, they get better and better at reading. They get more and more fluent, more and more automatic, and it can get to be quite difficult to actually spot any problems in these areas. Now, it may be that the person took a long time to get to that point, and that when they're learning new things, it takes them a long time to learn new things. And that means that they are going to need some adjustments when they're learning new things and when they're sitting exams. So we need to be aware of that. And then there's the difficulty that standardised attainment tests, so the tests of things like reading, writing, spelling, sometimes they are only standardised or they're only developed with a population that is of a younger age, so they're often developed with people maybe up to the age of 25 or 26. So if you're working with adults beyond that age, you're not actually going to get a score as such, but you can still use the tests and do a qualitative analysis. How hard are they finding these tasks? How fluent are they? How automatic is it? Does it make the person feel quite stressed? Are they quite inventive in their strategies for how to approach the task? That type of thing. Is there a difference? There may be a test with various subtests, and although we can't get scores, we can see whether they're doing better in some subtests than in others. So there's things that we can do, but it just makes it that bit more of a challenge. And then there's the fact that people will often have developed really, really good compensatory strategies. So a person who's not got a great working memory will have developed all kinds of ways of keeping things in their head while they're doing a task. And if I'm doing a memory task that's maybe only 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 minutes long, the person can pull out all the stops and do pretty well in that test. And that's what I was saying before, is that we don't just look at how well the person does in the test, we're also looking at how they carry out that test. So I'm going to talk now about the assessment report and things like what might the report highlight, what do the results mean, what does the report look like, and an explanation of some of the terminology that you might find in a report. So what you're looking for, I would say, in a report is that it should be highlighting that person's areas of strength, because it's really important, I think, to demonstrate that a person might need reasonable adjustments, they might need exam accommodations, but to do that without undermining that person's abilities and their skills and their talents and their motivation and their hard work. So very much strengths-based approach. Also explaining if there are difficulties, what the reasons for these difficulties might be is not because the person's not working hard, it's not because they're not putting in the hours, it's not because they're not concentrating or not trying. So we're looking for reasons for these difficulties that kind of don't put the blame on that person, if you like. And also putting the results in context for that person. So what do the results mean in terms of the support that that person might need to demonstrate their potential, whether that is in the learning environment or the work environment, and very often it would be both environments. So the reports that I do would comply with the best practice guidance that is written up by SASC, and SASC is the SPLD, Specific Learning Difficulties Assessment Standards Committee. And I'll explain in the next few slides what the format of that type of report is. In terms of an adult report, there's a full report, and the adult would get the full report, but I would also produce an executive summary report, and that is the one that the adult can provide to the employer. And it's quite important to have these two different sorts of reports. So the executive summary report takes the adult report, and I remove all of the confidential information. So it wouldn't have the person's address, it wouldn't have their date of birth, it wouldn't have the actual scores. It would have the overall pattern of scores. So I might be saying that certain scores are in, the high range or the average range or the low range, and explaining that profile, how the scores relate to each other. And it would have recommendations for things that might help that person. But that's all that the employer needs to know. They don't need to know the background information that that person's told me, so that wouldn't be in there. So the executive summary report is a shorter report, and that is the one that would go to an employer. So the SASC recommended report format would start with a cover sheet. The cover sheet has the person's name, it has their address, it has date of birth, when the assessment took place, has the name of the assessor, contact details for the assessor. And then the next part of the report is an overview, and that should really provide a summary of the outcomes of the assessment, the impact of whatever difficulty you might have found, whatever profile you might have found, the impact that that is having on that person's learning, on that person's way of working, and key recommendations. And then the next section is a summary of that background information, the type of thing I was talking about earlier, where I would have gathered that information in advance. Also, I would talk to the person on the day before we don't plunge into a whole bunch of tests straight away. We chat about the things that they might have told me in the questionnaires, and I'd just get a little bit more information about things like the developmental things, if the person maybe has had speech therapy, if they've ever had hearing difficulties, if they've ever had difficulties with their vision, with their coordination. I'd be looking at things like family incidents. Is there an incidence of dyslexia or other learning difficulties in the family? Be looking at the languages spoken, because if English is an additional language, if it's not your first language, that's very important. We need to take that into account when we're doing the assessment. Be also looking at the person's experiences in education, how much support they've had, what it was like doing exams, what that experience was like for them. Did exam results reflect that person's ability? And their current concerns, so what do they think about their abilities in reading, about, what's their spelling like, what's their handwriting like, what's their written expression like, do they find it hard to write a report or write an email or write a letter, and looking at the strengths as well, not just at the difficulties. And then the next section is called test conditions. So in that section, we'll be talking about, whether the person was comfortable during the assessment, in a well-lit room, was it well ventilated, If we're doing it online, I'll be looking at how good was the Wi-Fi connection, did we ever have to stop and restart, and whether there were any kind of things that really should be reported on that might have affected that assessment. The next part of the report would be the cognitive profile, so that would be where I would talk about the results of the tests of verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, that's the non-verbal reasoning, working memory and processing speed, and things like phonological processing speed as well. And the next section is called additional diagnostic evidence, and that's a section where I would put information about screening tests that I might carry out for other things that might be co-occurring with dyslexia. So if I think a person might be dyspraxic, for example, so dyspraxia would describe whether the person has coordination difficulties. So if I carried out screening tests on the basis of the questionnaires that the person's filled in, I might think that they might have some coordination difficulties. And if I carried out any tests that are relating to that to see if they might be dyspraxic, they would appear in that section, additional diagnostic evidence. Then the next section talks about attainments, so that's where we'd have the results of the attainment tests, and the attainment tests are the tests of literacy, tests to do with spelling, reading, writing, written expression, so the person's abilities to express themselves in writing, and handwriting tests. I'd also be looking at possibly numeracy if that was an area that the person felt that they were having difficulties with. The next section is a confirmation of the diagnostic decision, and that confirms the decision that was described originally in that overview that I spoke about earlier. And then the next section is recommendations. That's quite a long section because the recommendations will depend on the environment that you're talking about. So some recommendations might be in relation to the learning environment, some recommendations might be in relation to the work environment, and there would be recommendations that may be personal recommendations for that person, maybe for study, that type of thing. And at the end there are a series of appendices. There should be an appendix explaining all the statistical terms that are used in the report, so that if a person sees a term they're not too sure about, they can check what that means in the appendix. There's an appendix that gives all the test scores. I also put tables within the report so the person can have a visual of what the test scores look like. And there's appendices looking at definitions. So if you find that a person's dyslexic, there should be the definition of dyslexia included in the report so that they can see, well, okay, I'm dyslexic, what is dyslexia? There should also be another appendix which gives information on all of the tests that you administered. The age range that they're appropriate for, where they were standardised, standardised maybe in the USA or in the UK, that type of thing. References, so if you wanted to find that test, you could find more information about it. And then if there were any further references that you thought were appropriate, they should be in an appendix at the end as well. I think the part of the report that probably most people are interested in, once they've discovered what the difficulties and where the strengths are, is the recommendations. What do we do about it? Because there's no point in doing all of this work for an assessment if we don't have something practical to go on ahead with. So there would be general recommendations, and these would usually be in relation to study support. How is that person going to be helped to revise for the subject that they're learning? And also exam arrangements. Study support is often to do with helping the person with working memory, how to organise things, how to break tasks down into little tasks so that they're not having to hold all the information in working memory at one go. Exam arrangements would very often be extra time. The standard amount of extra time is 25%, and sometimes the person might need to use a computer for extended writing. Very often that's a good idea if they have good enough keyboard skills. Sometimes it's a case of adjusting the environment to suit the person or adjusting the work tasks. So, for example, quite often I'll be speaking to somebody who maybe has to work in an open plan environment and they need to have some quiet space. maybe not all the time, but maybe there are aspects of the work where they really have to sit and concentrate for periods of time. And when they have to do that, they need to have a place that they can go where they can do that, or maybe, bigger divisions between them and other people, or maybe noise cancelling headphones. Some people like to be near a window, some people don't like to be near a window, just whatever works for that person. And sometimes adjusting the work task so that the person maybe does it in a different way. Maybe instead of taking notes, they might be able to just speak into their iPhone or an iPad and record notes, that type of thing. And also improving that individual's skills, and whether that be study skills or whether that be in terms of how to maybe express themselves in writing. So what kind of things might help that person based on what we found in the assessment? And I think it's got to be very practical, it's got to be manageable, it's got to be doable. So extra time is very, very often the thing that would be recommended, because I think I said before, even if your processing speed is fine, if you've got a difficulty with working memory, what that means is you're often going to have to break a task down into smaller tasks. Or maybe you're going to have time, take the time to reread the question or reread what you've written. And all of these are more time consuming way of carrying out the work. So it's not necessarily that the person is slow, but the way that they work is a different way, and they're going to need more time to do that. So extra time is a very usual adjustment for academic support. Use of a laptop. Obviously the person has to have good enough keyboard skills, and these days at university level or college level, very often the person will have that, good enough keyboard skills to be able to do that. I think a key thing is removing the burden from working memory. So, for instance, instead of having to take notes, it would be much better if there was a whiteboard, if the person could just get a copy of what was on that board electronically or take a photo. Much better than having to kind of write all that down or even type it all down, because the time involved in that could be better spent doing other things. So it's a case of making the best use of that person's time, making the best use of their kind of cognitive energy, if you like, and then support in organising things and planning things. Because if, I was saying before, if at the root of the dyslexia there's a difficulty with working memory or processing speed, that has a knock-on effect on wider things, not just on the person's ability to read, write and spell, but on their ability to maybe organise or structure a piece of writing, but also organising and planning their lives, their work routine, their study routine. If you've got to hold a lot of information in your head at once, you might forget a bit of it, and that can end up with a kind of, you end up with a feeling that you're quite disorganised. And having things that are structured, helping the person to create patterns of working, that just takes a lot of burden from their working memory. In terms of support at work, the assessment that I do is called a diagnostic assessment, and what should really follow from that is what's called a workplace needs assessment. So basically the diagnostic assessment is looked at by a workplace needs assessor, who then looks at the strengths and weaknesses that that person has, and looks at the very much more detail of what that person's type of work is like. So I would make broad generic recommendations. For instance, that the person should have extra time for activities that involve a lot of writing, that they should have a quiet place to work in, that they should have access to technologies. But the workplace needs assessor would be looking at maybe the specific types of technology that would work in that person's environment. So, for example, some places of work, it's possible to use certain types of software, and some of them it's not because of firewalls and things like that. And that's usually done through the Access to Work scheme. But the main thing with recommendations for work is that they need to be considered in the context of a full risk assessment, and that's not what I would do. That would be the responsibility of the people in the workplace, and it has to be agreed collaboratively. There's no good the workplace coming up with a bunch of strategies and just saying to the person, okay, we're giving you this and that is how we think you're going to work best. It's got to be something where that individual has a very strong input into that process. And it needs to be reviewed as the person's needs change over time. So the person's needs might change over time, but also the type of work that they're doing might change over time. So in some tasks, they might not need an awful lot of support or help at all. Then if their work changes slightly, they might then need support in certain parts of that task, or at periods where they're having to learn more information. That's probably the time when the support is going to need to be greatest. And I think a key thing for employers to know is that these adjustments aren't necessarily very onerous. They don't necessarily involve a lot of work for them, and usually, or very often, they can help all workers. And I think the best analogy I can think of here is, the remotes that we have for TVs. They were designed for people who had mobility difficulties, but we all find them really useful now. I don't think there's anybody who knows how to turn the volume up on their telly without using a remote. I don't even know if you can anymore. So you can see that things that start off looking like it's an adjustment for a specific person, it can be useful for the whole workforce. Now, the thing about reports is that they are supposed to be accessible so that the person who gets the report can understand what is in that report. And we really try to make reports accessible and understandable, but we do have to use some jargon because for the person to get the adjustments that they need, we have to explain why it is they need them. And some of that explaining means using terms that are understood at the kind of educational or work level. So we have to talk about things like a cognitive profile. So I'm going to talk about anyway a few of these areas of terminology. I went through a report just to see the things that I think might be problematic. Within the reports that I write, when I use one of these terms the first time, I would give an explanation of what that means. And also, like I said before, the report structure, there should be a section at the end that explains all the statistical terms. So a cognitive profile is that the kind of pattern that you see between the verbal comprehension, the perceptual reasoning, which is the non-verbal reasoning on the one hand, and on the other hand, we've got the working memory and we've got the processing speed. And the pattern is, are the abilities keeping up with the style of processing? So if the abilities are up here and the style of processing is here, that's likely to be a difficulty occurring as a result of that, and that's what they call the spiky profile. So that's what we'll talk about cognitive profiles. A working memory, what's really, really important to remember here is that is just what you've got in your head at that one time. So some people can hold a lot of information in their head at one time for a short period of time. Say if you're trying to remember a phone number before you write it down, or you're trying to do mental arithmetic, that's your working memory that you're using there. Long-term memory is the information that you've learned over time, and like I said before, that's separate from working memory. Attainments are the things that we have learned over time in school that we've been taught, so that would be things like spelling, reading, writing, numeracy. Phonological skills are the skills of matching sounds to the way that we write them in our language. So we write a T and an H make the sound th in our language. So matching these is quite important, because if we see a word that we've never seen before, we could decode it using phonics. If a younger child could look at the word umbrella, they could go umbrella. Oh, that's an umbrella. Now, obviously, that doesn't work so well when we have words that are more unusual, where the rules don't apply. But phonological skills are one of the core things that we need for reading words that we don't know straight away, and also for trying to spell words that we don't know. So if you don't know how to spell a word but you can write it phonetically, that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. That means that the person reading what you've written knows what word you were aiming for, and it doesn't matter if it's phonetic. If you've got a dyslexic difficulty, it's good to be able to spell things phonetically, because that makes it understandable to other people. Standard scores are the scores that we get from standardized tests. So standardized tests are standardized on a large population. So they give these tests to a large population and figure out where is the middle point, where are the kind of extreme points, and they get this kind of standardized level of scores. So we can compare, for instance, the cognitive tests are all standardised, the attainment tests we use are all standardised. When we're looking at these tests, we can say, well, this person we're working with is 35 years old. We can see if their score is at the level we would expect for a 35-year-old, because the tests have been used on people in that age group and they've found out what the average score would be for a 35-year-old. So that's how we can get an idea of the person's level of ability in relation to other people. Percentiles, that describes where a person is in relation to the kind of the whole range of scores. So a person whose score is in the 50th percentile, so we're talking 1 to 100, the 50th percentile would be bang in the middle, because 50 is right in the middle between 1 and 100. So if you're in the 50th percentile, you would be in the average range. If you're in the 90th percentile, you're in the top 10%, because there's only 90 up to 100 still to go. So that's what percentiles are. But they should be explained also in one of the appendices. So this isn't a thing that you should have to know off by heart, but you could just double check if you wanted to understand it. Exam arrangements describes, that's the term that is used for adjustments that are made for people to help them to achieve what they're able to do in exams. So classically, extra time, access to computer, but it could be other things. It could be things like supervised rest breaks. It could be the opportunity to read aloud. Sometimes a person might need to sit an exam in a separate room from other people if they're very anxious, that type of thing. So there are a range of arrangements. And reasonable adjustments would describe the kind of things that might be reasonably expected for an employer to do for an employee who has a learning difficulty. So what I've been talking about here is assessing adults for dyslexia, talking about why do adults have an assessment, what kind of reasons would they have for coming along for an assessment, what should they expect, what's the process of assessment, what's involved in that whole process, and what could they expect in the report, what kind of things might be in the report, what kind of things might result from the report. And I hope this has been helpful for you. The next slide will have my website and my email address, and you can get in touch with me if you've got any questions. Thanks for listening.